3 bodies. That's what the rescue helicopter found on February 14, 2021, in a gully below the Aiguille du Midi near Chamonix, France. 3 skiers, all dead, all tangled together in a mass of snow, equipment, and frozen limbs. The French mountain police had expected to find 1, maybe 2. They found 3. And here's what made this recovery different from every other avalanche fatality that winter. Here's what made investigators stop, look at each other, and realize they were dealing with something they had never seen before. Marc Duval, a 41-year-old backcountry specialist with 15 years of experience, had survived the avalanche. He'd outrun the slide. He had come to a stop in a safe zone, away from the debris field on stable ground. His body position proved it. His equipment placement confirmed it. Every piece of physical evidence showed that Marc Duval had done everything right. And then something killed him. Not the mountain. Not the avalanche. Not a secondary slide. Something else. When the coroner examined his body, she found injuries that didn't match an avalanche burial. Blunt force trauma to his chest and skull. Impact patterns consistent with a high-speed collision. With a person. Marc Duval, the man who thought he had escaped, was killed by one of the other victims. A victim he never knew was on the mountain. A victim the avalanche carried directly into him at over 60 kilometers per hour. He thought he was alone. He stopped to catch his breath. He believed he had survived. He was wrong. This is the complete story of the Aiguille du Midi tragedy. Not the summary. Not the news headline. The full investigation. Every decision, every mistake, every second of the final moments of 3 skiers who never should have crossed paths. Because here's what the initial reports never told you. Marc Duval wasn't just unlucky. He was killed by a chain of decisions, some his own, some made by complete strangers, that put 3 people on a collision course neither could see coming. The 2 other victims were Thierry Beaumont, 53, a semi-retired engineer from Lyon, and his nephew, Lucas Girard, 24, a university student making his first serious backcountry descent. They had started their run from a different ridge, a ridge Marc Duval never even looked at. A ridge that was 700 meters above his position, when the first crack appeared in the snowpack. 3 people. 3 completely separate decisions to ski that slope on that morning. One avalanche that swept 2 of them into the third. And the worst part? If any one of them had made a different choice, any single small deviation from their plan, all 3 would be alive right now. What you're about to hear took investigators 4 months to piece together. It required avalanche simulations, GPS data extraction from buried devices, witness interviews from 3 countries, and a forensic reconstruction that became a case study in mountain rescue training across Europe. If you're new here, this channel covers the full stories behind the deadliest moments in the mountains. Not summaries, full investigations. If that's what you're looking for, you know what to do. We've got more coming. Now, to understand how 3 strangers ended up dying together on a mountainside, we need to go back 48 hours. Back to when Marc Duval made a phone call that would set everything in motion. Marc Duval called his wife Camille on the evening of February 12, 2021. It was 9:47 p.m. She remembered the exact time because she had just put their daughter, Elise, to bed. Elise was 7 years old. She had asked her father that morning when he was coming home. 2 more days, Marc had told her. 2 more days and I'll be back for your birthday. Elise was turning 8 on February 16th. Marc had sworn that he would be home in time. He had even bought her a present already. A purple ski helmet with butterfly stickers. It was sitting in the trunk of his car in the Chamonix parking garage, wrapped in paper Elise had picked out herself. Marc Duval was not a reckless man. That's what everyone who knew him said in the weeks after his death. He was methodical. Patient. He checked conditions obsessively. He had turned back from more runs than he had completed because he didn't like what he saw. His friends called him the calculator. He would sit in the lodge, studying weather reports, snowpack analyses, and satellite imagery, while everyone else was already on the mountain. Some people found it annoying. Those people weren't invited on his expeditions. Marc had been skiing the Chamonix backcountry for 15 years. He knew every gully, every ridge, every aspect and elevation where avalanche danger concentrated. He had taken formal avalanche certification courses, 3 of them. He carried a beacon, probe, and shovel on every single run. He never skied alone without telling someone exactly where he would be. On the morning of February 13th, he filed his route plan with the Chamonix Mountain Rescue Office. Standard practice. The run he selected was rated as considerable avalanche danger, a 3 on the 5-point European scale. Not minimal, but manageable for someone with his experience. He had skied this exact line a dozen times before. What Mark didn't know, couldn't have known, was that 700 meters above his planned route, 2 other skiers were making their own decisions. Decisions that would intersect with his in ways that physics made inevitable but human planning never anticipated. Thierry Beaumont was 53 years old. He had taken early retirement from his engineering firm 18 months before, cashing out stock options that let him spend his winters in the Alps. His wife had died of cancer in 2018, and skiing had become his therapy, his obsession, his reason to get out of bed. Thierry wasn't as experienced as Mark. He had maybe 40 days of backcountry skiing in his life, respectable for an amateur, but nowhere near expert level. He knew his limitations. That's why he always skied with a guide or a more experienced partner. On this trip, that partner was supposed to be his nephew, Lucas Girard. Lucas was 24, a graduate student in mechanical engineering at the University of Grenoble, athletic, confident, and eager to prove himself. He had been skiing since he was 4 years old, resort skiing, mostly, with a handful of guided backcountry tours. But Lucas had never led a backcountry descent. He had never been responsible for route finding in avalanche terrain. He had never made the life-or-death judgment calls that separate experienced backcountry skiers from tourists. Thierry didn't know this. He assumed that because Lucas was young and fit and had grown up on skis, he knew what he was doing. He never asked directly. And Lucas, proud, embarrassed to admit his inexperience to an uncle he wanted to impress, never volunteered the truth. This misunderstanding would kill them both, and it would kill a stranger they would never meet. The night before the avalanche, Thierry and Lucas had dinner at a small restaurant in Chamonix. They talked about the next day's plan. Lucas had found a route online, a YouTube video from a ski influencer who had descended it the previous season. The video made it look easy. Smooth powder, wide open terrain, minimal hazards. What the video didn't show was that it had been filmed in January after weeks of stable weather. What the video didn't explain was that February had brought 3 significant snowfall events, each one adding a new weak layer to the snowpack. What the video's creator never mentioned was that he had nearly triggered a slide himself, footage he edited out before posting. Lucas showed Thierry the video on his phone. Thierry watched the skier carving effortless turns through untouched snow. It looked beautiful. It looked safe. "This is the one," Lucas said. Thierry trusted him. Why wouldn't he? Lucas was young, but he was smart. He was family. They didn't check the avalanche bulletin that night. Lucas had checked it 2 days earlier, when the danger was rated moderate, and assumed it hadn't changed. It had. The rating had been upgraded to considerable, with specific warnings about wind-loaded slopes above 500 meters. The slope they planned to ski was at 800 meters. It faced northwest. It had been loaded with fresh, wind-deposited snow for 48 hours. They didn't know any of this. They went to bed early, excited for the morning. 300 meters below their planned starting point, in a different lodge on the other side of town, Mark Duval was going through his pre-trip checklist. He tested his avalanche beacon. He checked the batteries. He reviewed the morning's bulletin one more time. The bulletin mentioned instability on north-facing slopes. Mark's route faced northeast. Not ideal, but the angle was moderate, around 30 degrees, below the prime avalanche starting zone of 35 to 45 degrees. He judged the risk acceptable. What the bulletin couldn't tell him was that 700 meters above his route, there was a slope facing northwest at 38 degrees. A slope where 2 inexperienced skiers would trigger a slide at 10:47 a.m. the next morning. A slide that would travel 1.2 kilometers downhill, gaining mass and speed, until it swept through the exact gully where Mark Duval would be catching his breath after his own smaller encounter with moving snow. If you're following along and this story is hitting different than other videos you've seen, consider subscribing. This channel goes deep on the investigations everyone else skips over. More like this coming soon. 3 skiers. 3 separate plans. 3 sets of decisions made in isolation. None of them knew the others existed. In 12 hours they would all be dead. And the mountain was already preparing to bring them together. Blank, underscore, blank, slash, slash. February 14th, 2021. Valentine's Day. The sky over Chamonix was clear for the first time in 4 days. Mark Duval woke at 6:15 a.m. He checked the weather on his phone. Sunshine, light winds, temperatures hovering around -8 Celsius. Perfect conditions. He sent a text to Camille. Beautiful day. Home tomorrow. Kissy lease for me. She responded with a heart emoji. It was the last message they would ever exchange. Mark ate breakfast alone in his rental apartment. Oatmeal, coffee, an energy bar he stuffed in his jacket pocket for later. He was methodical about nutrition, just like everything else. He knew that backcountry skiing burned 4,000 calories on a hard day. He knew that low blood sugar led to poor decisions. He had read the accident reports. He had seen what happened when people got tired and sloppy. By 8:30 a.m., he was on the Aiguille du Midi cable car, riding toward the 842-meter summit station. The cabin was crowded with skiers, snowboarders, and tourists. Mark stood near the window, watching the glacier slide past beneath him. He was thinking about the descent, running through the route in his mind, identifying the danger zones, planning his escape routes if something went wrong. At the same moment, in a different cable car cabin, Thierry and Luca Beaumont were doing none of those things. They were taking selfies. Lucas had his phone out, capturing the view, the mountains, his uncle's smiling face. Thierry looked happy, genuinely happy, in a way he hadn't since his wife's funeral. This trip was supposed to be a bonding experience, a way to connect with his nephew, a way to feel alive again. He felt alive. He felt invincible. He felt like nothing could touch him on a day this beautiful. That feeling was a warning sign. Experienced backcountry travelers know that perfect weather often masks imperfect snowpack. They know that clear skies and sunshine warm the surface layer, weakening the bonds that hold the snow in place. They know that the most dangerous days are often the most beautiful. Lucas didn't know this, and Thierry, in his grief-fueled euphoria, had forgotten it. They reached the summit station at 9:20 a.m. Lucas led the way to their starting point, a traverse across the ridge that would bring them to the top of their chosen slope. The slope from the YouTube video. The slope that was about to become a mass grave. Meanwhile, Mark Duval had already begun his descent on a completely different aspect of the mountain. His route took him down a northeast-facing gully that channeled into a wider basin below. It was a run he had done many times. He knew every turn. At 10:15 a.m., Mark was halfway down his route when he felt the first vibration. A small crack appeared in the snow 20 meters above him. Not a full avalanche, just a minor slough, a surface layer releasing. Mark reacted instantly. He angled his skis to the right, pushing toward the edge of the gully where a rock outcropping offered protection. The slough passed behind him, carrying maybe 50 cubic meters of snow into the basin below. Mark stopped behind the rock, breathing hard. His heart was pounding. But he was safe. The debris had missed him by 10 meters. He waited 2 minutes for the slope to stabilize. Then he continued his descent, moving carefully now, testing each section before committing his weight. By 10:40 a.m., he had reached the runout zone, the flat area at the bottom of the gully where avalanche debris typically came to rest. He was safe. He was in the clear. The hard part was over. Mark stopped to catch his breath. He pulled out his energy bar and took a bite. He looked up at the slope he had just descended and felt the familiar satisfaction of a successful run. One more descent, and he would head back to town. Pack up. Drive home tomorrow morning. Make it to Elisa's birthday party with time to spare. He was standing in exactly the wrong place. 700 meters above him, Lucas Girard had just made the worst decision of his life. Lucas and Thierry had reached their starting point at 10:35 a.m. The slope stretched below them, a perfect canvas of untracked powder. Lucas felt a surge of excitement. This was going to be the run of his life, the one he would tell stories about for years. Thierry asked if they should do a stability test. He remembered reading about that somewhere. Digging a pit, checking the snow layers, looking for weak spots. Nah, it looks solid, Lucas said. That guy on YouTube didn't do any tests. He just dropped in. Thierry hesitated. something felt off. The snow looked different than he expected. Heavier. More settled. Like it was waiting for something. But Lucas was already clicking into his bindings. Already pointing his skis downhill. Already committed. "You comin'?" Lucas called back. Thierry pushed aside his doubts. He trusted his nephew. He wanted to believe. At 10:47 a.m., Lucas Girard pushed off and made his first turn. The slope held for exactly 4 seconds. Then the entire mountainside began to move. Subscribe if you're invested in this story. The algorithm notices when you do, and it helps more people find these investigations. What happens next took 4 months to reconstruct. Blank, underscore, blank, slash, slash, slash. The fracture line was 200 meters wide. Investigators would later measure it precisely. 203 meters of snow releasing simultaneously. A slab approximately 80 centimeters deep, containing an estimated 15,000 cubic meters of snow and ice. Enough to bury a football field 3 meters deep. Enough to kill anyone caught in its path. Lucas never had a chance to react. He was still completing his first turn when the world dropped out from under him. One moment he was skiing. The next he was falling, tumbling, being swallowed by a white wave that moved faster than his mind could process. Thierry, still at the top of the slope, watched his nephew disappear. He screamed Lucas's name. The sound was swallowed by the roar of the avalanche. A sound witnesses often compare to a freight train or a jet engine, but those comparisons don't capture the texture of it. The deep, guttural vibration that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. Thierry had 3 seconds to decide what to do. 3 seconds between his nephew's disappearance and the fracture propagating to his own position. He made the wrong choice. Instead of trying to ski laterally, toward the edge of the slide, Thierry froze. He stood there, skis pointed downhill, staring at the chaos below, unable to process what was happening. The second fracture took him at 10:47 and 11 seconds. He felt the snow shift beneath his feet, and then he was moving, not skiing, not falling, but being carried. Swept along like a leaf in a river, tumbling, end over end, through a churning mass of white that filled his mouth, his nose, his eyes. The avalanche was now traveling at approximately 60 kilometers per hour. It would accelerate to 80 before it reached the run-out zone. The run-out zone where Mark Duval was standing. Mark heard the avalanche before he saw it. That freight train sound. That vibration in his bones. He looked up and saw a wall of white boiling down the mountainside. Not from the slope he had just ascended, but from somewhere higher. Somewhere he hadn't even considered. He had 2 seconds to react. 2 seconds to process that an avalanche was coming from a slope he didn't even know was occupied. 2 seconds to understand that his position, the safe zone, the run-out zone, the place where the danger was supposed to be over, was directly in the path of a slide that had started 700 meters above him. Mark did everything right. He abandoned his poles, he kicked off his skis, he tried to run to sprint toward the rock outcropping that had protected him earlier. He made it 4 steps before the debris cloud hit him. But here's what the investigators discovered 4 months later. Here's what makes this case unlike anything they had ever seen. Mark Duval was not killed by the avalanche debris. The main flow of the slide passed 12 meters to his left. He was caught in the powder cloud, the airborne snow that billows ahead of the main mass. But he was not buried, not swept away, not crushed by the weight of 15,000 cubic meters of snow. He was standing in the aftermath, covered in powder, disoriented but conscious, when the bodies hit him. Thierry Beaumont's body was traveling at approximately 65 kilometers per hour when it struck Mark Duval from behind. The impact drove Mark forward, off his feet, face first into the debris field. Before he could react, before he could even understand what had happened, Lucas Girard's body, traveling at nearly the same speed, struck him from above. The collision lasted less than half a second. Mark Duval's ribs were shattered. His skull was fractured. His spine was severed at the 3rd cervical vertebra. He was dead before his body came to rest in the blood-stained snow. Thierry and Lucas were already dead. They had asphyxiated during the slide, their airways packed with snow, their lungs unable to expand against the pressure of the debris. Standard avalanche deaths. Tragic, but not unusual. What killed Mark was unusual. What killed Mark was almost impossible. The forensic pathologist who examined the bodies, Dr. Céline Marchand, initially assumed all three had been buried together. It took her 2 days of analysis to realize the truth. Mark's injuries were inconsistent with burial. They were consistent with impact, high-speed impact, with a human body. She had never seen anything like it. In 30 years of mountain forensics, she had documented every conceivable cause of death: falls, exposure, burial, equipment failure, animal attacks. She had never documented a skier killed by collision with an avalanche victim. She didn't even know how to classify it. Technically, she wrote in her report, Duval died from trauma sustained during the avalanche event. But the mechanism of death was not burial or debris impact. The mechanism was collision with another victim who was being transported by the slide. Mark Duval was killed by a dead man traveling at highway speed. He never saw it coming. He never knew the other skiers existed. He thought he was alone. He was wrong. And that mistake cost him his life. The reconstruction of those final seconds took investigators 3 months. They used GPS data from all 3 beacons, trajectory analysis, debris field mapping, and biomechanical modeling to determine exactly how 3 strangers ended up dying together in a gully that only one of them had planned to visit. But the reconstruction only told them what happened. It didn't answer the harder question. Why? Blank. Underscore. Blank. Slash. 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 The rescue operation began at 11:23 a.m., 36 minutes after the avalanche released. A group of ski tourers on an adjacent ridge had witnessed the slide and called emergency services. They reported seeing the fracture line propagate across the slope, watching the debris cloud billow into the valley, and hearing what they initially thought was thunder but was actually the sound of 15,000 cubic meters of snow grinding against rock. None of them saw the 3 skiers. The victims were already dead by the time the witnesses looked up. The Peloton de Gendarmerie de Haute Montagne, the elite French mountain police unit, scrambled their helicopter from the Chamonix base within 12 minutes. The pilot, Captain Henri Vautrin, had flown more than 1,000 rescue missions in his career. He had seen avalanche debris fields before. He had recovered bodies from places most people couldn't imagine. But he had never seen what he found at 11:58 a.m. in the runout zone below the Aiguille du Midi. 3 bodies, tangled together, blood staining the snow in a pattern that suggested violence, not burial. My first thought was a collision, Captain Vautrin later told investigators. Like 2 skiing groups had hit each other at speed. But then I saw the debris field, and I realized they had to have come down with the slide. I just couldn't understand how they ended up together like that. The recovery team extracted the bodies over the next 4 hours. Each one was photographed in situ, their positions documented, their equipment cataloged. The mountain police treated it as a crime scene, not because they suspected foul play, but because something about the configuration didn't make sense. Mark Duval was lying face down, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. His skis were found 30 meters away, still attached to his boots, suggesting he had kicked them off before impact. His poles were never recovered. Thierry Beaumont was found partially on top of Mark, his body compressed into a fetal position by the force of the debris. His skis were shattered. His helmet was cracked but still attached. Lucas Girard was found 2 meters from the other 2, face up, his eyes open and frozen. His avalanche beacon was still transmitting. His airbag pack, a safety device designed to keep victims on the surface of a slide, had never been deployed. Later analysis showed he had never pulled the activation handle. He hadn't had time. By 4:30 p.m., all 3 bodies were in the Chamonix morgue. Dr. Céline Marchand began her examinations the next morning. The families were notified that evening. Camille Duval was making dinner when the gendarmes knocked on her door. Elise was in the living room, watching cartoons. Camille saw the uniforms through the window and knew immediately. She knew before they said a word. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She walked to the kitchen, turned off the stove, and asked the officers to please keep their voices down. Her daughter didn't know yet. She wanted one more night before Elise's world changed forever. Elise never got her purple helmet. It's still in the trunk of Mark's car, which sat in the Chamonix parking garage for 3 weeks, before Camille could bring herself to drive it home. Thierry Beaumont's family in Lyon received the call at 7:15 p.m. His sister, Lucas's mother, was at home when the phone rang. She answered, expecting it to be Thierry, calling to say they had finished their ski day and were heading to dinner. Instead, she learned that her brother and her son were both dead. The sound she made, according to the gendarme who delivered the news, was not a scream. It was something worse. A low, animal moan that went on for minutes. The sound of a woman whose entire world had just been erased in a single phone call. She would later tell journalists that she didn't remember the next 3 days. Her husband found her sitting in Lucas's childhood bedroom, holding a stuffed bear he had kept since he was 5. She had been there for 11 hours. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't moved. She had just sat there, holding the bear, waiting for her son to come home. He was never coming home. The investigation that followed was the most comprehensive avalanche analysis ever conducted in the Chamonix region. Not because of the death toll. 3 fatalities was tragic, but not unprecedented. What made it comprehensive was the mystery at its center. How did Marc Duval die? The initial autopsy raised more questions than it answered. Dr. Marchand's findings were clear. Duval had not died from burial. His airways were clear. His lungs showed no signs of suffocation. His injuries were traumatic. Blunt force, high velocity, multiple impact points. But the debris field didn't explain those injuries. The main avalanche flow had missed him. The powder cloud alone wouldn't have been sufficient to cause that level of trauma. That's when Dr. Marchand began examining the other bodies more carefully. She found fabric fibers embedded in Marc Duval's jacket, fibers that matched Thierry Beaumont's ski pants. She found a scratch pattern on Marc's helmet that matched the edge of Lucas Girard's binding. She found blood, 2 different types, mixed with snow inside the impact zone. And she realized, with growing horror, what had actually happened. Marc Duval hadn't been killed by an avalanche. He had been killed by the victims of an avalanche. 2 human bodies, traveling at highway speed, had slammed into a man who thought he had escaped, who thought he was safe, who thought he was alone. The report took 4 months to complete. When it was finally released, it became required reading for mountain rescue teams across Europe. Not because the avalanche itself was unusual. It was a textbook slab release, triggered by inexperienced skiers on an unstable slope. What made it required reading was the lesson it taught about runout zones, about the false sense of security that comes from reaching safe ground, about the reality that in the mountains, there is no such thing as completely safe. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is made for. We go deep where others skim the surface. Subscribe and you won't miss the next investigation. The investigation answered the what, the how, but it took another 2 months to answer the why. Blank, underscore, blank, slash, 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 slash. The controversy began 3 weeks after the funerals. It started with a blog post. An anonymous writer, claiming to be a friend of Thierry Beaumont, published a detailed account of the trip's planning. The post included text messages, screenshots, and a damning accusation. Lucas Girard had lied about his experience level. He had led his uncle into terrain he wasn't qualified to assess. He had ignored multiple warning signs on the morning of the avalanche. The post went viral in the European ski community within 48 hours. Skiing forums lit up with debates. Some people blamed Lucas, a young man who got in over his head and killed his uncle and an innocent stranger. Others blamed Thierry, an experienced adult who should have verified his partner's qualifications before trusting him with his life. Others blamed neither of them. A smaller faction pointed fingers at something less personal. The system, the infrastructure of backcountry skiing that lets anyone with money and enthusiasm walk into avalanche terrain without training, certification, or oversight. In the Alps, there are no mandatory qualifications for backcountry skiing. You don't need to prove you can read an avalanche bulletin. You don't need to demonstrate beacon proficiency. You don't need to show you understand the basics of snow science. You just need to buy a lift ticket, ride to the top, and duck under the boundary rope. Thousands of people do it every winter. Most of them survive. Some of them don't. But the debate about systemic failures didn't drive the news coverage. What drove the news coverage was the lawsuit. In April 2021, Camille Duval filed a civil suit against the estates of Thierry Beaumont and Lucas Girard. The suit alleged negligence, wrongful death, and failure to exercise reasonable care in avalanche terrain. It sought damages for loss of income, emotional suffering, and the cost of raising a lease without a father. The amount? 3 million euros. The lawsuit created a rift that divided communities across France. On one side, people who saw Camille as a grieving widow, seeking justice for her husband's senseless death. On the other, people who saw her as a vulture, attacking dead men who couldn't defend themselves, compounding the grief of families who had already lost everything. Thierry's sister, Lucas's mother, gave a single interview about the lawsuit. She looked directly into the camera and said, "My son made a mistake. He died for that mistake. My brother died for that mistake. And now this woman wants us to pay with the only thing we have left, Thierry's savings, which were supposed to help me survive the rest of my life. She wants us to suffer more. Hasn't there been enough suffering?" Camille never responded publicly. She let her lawyers speak for her. They argued, simply, that Marc Duval did nothing wrong. He was in a safe zone. He had filed his route plan. He had checked conditions. He had done everything a reasonable person would do. And he died because two strangers with no business being on that slope, with no training to assess its stability, with no awareness of the lives they were about to take, made choices that killed him. "This isn't about blame," her lawyer said in a press conference. "This is about responsibility. Actions have consequences. When your actions kill an innocent person, there should be accountability." The case was settled out of court in September 2021. The terms were sealed. Neither family has spoken about it since. But the settlement wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of the legacy. Because what happened in that gully below the Aiguille du Midi changed things. Not immediately, not dramatically, but measurably. The French Alpine Club revised its educational materials in early 2022. The revision included a new section on extended run-out zone awareness, teaching backcountry travelers that traditional safe zones might not be safe if larger slides originate from terrain features higher on the mountain. The case study they used was the Aiguille du Midi incident. The name they gave it was the Duval Protocol. Marc Duval, the man who did everything right, became a teaching tool. His death became a lesson. His final moments, reconstructed in detail, are now shown to avalanche safety students across Europe. There's something deeply uncomfortable about that. Something that sits wrong. Marc Duval didn't want to be a lesson. He wanted to ski powder with his friends, go home to his wife, and watch his daughter turn 8. He wanted a normal life. He got a case study. But there's also something else. Something that might, in some small way, justify the horror of what happened. Since the revised protocols were introduced, there have been 0 fatalities in the Chamonix region attributed to debris impact in traditional run-out zones. Whether this is statistical noise, coincidence, or the direct result of the Duval Protocol is impossible to know. What we do know is that somewhere, right now, a backcountry skier is standing in a run-out zone, catching their breath after a successful descent, and looking up, checking the slopes above them, asking themselves, is there anything higher that could send debris into my position? Marc Duval never asked that question. He didn't know he needed to. Now, because of him, others do. /Lise Duval turned 8 years old on February 16, 2021, 2 days after her father died. There was no party, no cake, no purple helmet with butterfly stickers. There was a living room full of relatives she barely knew, speaking in hushed voices, looking at her with the kind of pity that children recognize, even when they don't understand. There was her mother, red-eyed and distant, trying to hold together the pieces of a life that had shattered 48 hours earlier. There was an empty chair at the table where her father was supposed to sit. Camille Duval has never remarried. She moved from their apartment in Lyon to a smaller place in the countryside, away from the mountains, away from the ski community, away from the life she and Marc had built together. She works remotely now, translating technical documents. She rarely leaves the house except to walk Elise to school. Elise is 11 years old now. She has never been skiing. She says she never will. Why would I? She told a journalist who tracked down her mother for an anniversary piece. The mountains took my father. Why would I give them the chance to take me? Her mother cut the interview short after that. She hasn't spoken to media since. Thierry Beaumont's sister, whose name has been withheld from public reporting at her request, sold her family home in Lyon and moved to Portugal. She lives alone in a small apartment near the coast, as far from snow as the European continent allows. She does not maintain contact with the French Alpine Club, the ski community, or anyone connected to the world that took her brother and son. In the 3 years since the tragedy, she has not once returned to France. Some wounds don't heal. Some losses can't be integrated. Some people simply break, and the broken pieces never quite fit back together. The climbing community, the backcountry skiing community, processes tragedies differently. For them, death is an acceptable risk, a calculated wager. They mourn their dead, and then they return to the mountains, because the mountains are the only place they feel truly alive. The message boards moved on from the Aiguille du Midi tragedy within a few months. New deaths took its place, new case studies, new lessons to be learned and quickly forgotten. But some people remember. Captain Henri Vautrin, the helicopter pilot who recovered the bodies, retired from the mountain police in 2022. He said it wasn't the Duval case specifically that drove his decision, but that it didn't help. In his last interview, he said, "After 1,000 missions, you think you've seen everything. And then you see something new, something that shouldn't be possible, something that makes you question every assumption you ever had about this work. That's when you know it's time to stop." He flies private charters now, businessmen and tourists mostly. He doesn't take jobs that go above 2,000 meters. Dr. Céline Marchand, the pathologist who pieced together the mechanism of Mark's death, published a paper in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2022, Human Body Projectile Injuries and Avalanche Events, a case report and literature review. It has been cited 47 times. It is considered the definitive analysis of a death mechanism that had never been formally documented before. She still works the morgue in Chamonix. Every winter, she sees new bodies, new tragedies, new lessons that the living refuse to learn from the dead. "The mountains don't care about us," she said in an interview for a French documentary. "They're not cruel. They're not kind. They're just there. We're the ones who choose to climb them. We're the ones who make the decisions that get us killed. And we're the ones who have to live with the consequences, or die from them." Mark Duval made all the right decisions. He checked conditions. He filed his plan. He picked a conservative route. He reacted correctly when his slope released. He reached safe ground. And he died anyway. Because 700 meters above him, two strangers made the wrong decisions. And in the mathematics of avalanche physics, their mistakes became his death sentence. That's the lesson of the Aiguille du Midi tragedy. It's not about skill or preparation or experience. It's about the fundamental truth that in the mountains, you are not alone. Your safety depends not just on your choices, but on the choices of everyone above you. Strangers you'll never meet, whose decisions you'll never know about, whose mistakes can kill you without warning. Mark Duval thought he was alone on that slope. He wasn't. He thought he was safe. He wasn't. He thought he had survived. He hadn't. 3 bodies in a gully. 3 families destroyed. One lesson that the mountains teach again and again to anyone willing to listen. There is no such thing as safe ground. There are only the living and the dead. And on any given day, a single decision, yours or someone else's, determines which category you fall into. If this story affected you, drop a comment below. What do you think is the real lesson here? That the mountains are inherently unforgiving, or that better education could have prevented this? I want to know what you think. And if you want more deep investigations like this one, stories that go beyond the headlines, beyond the surface, into the full truth of what happened and why, subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell. We're just getting started. There are more stories to tell, more investigations to conduct, more lessons hidden in the snow. The mountains are still out there, and so are the bodies. Until next time, stay safe, make good decisions, and remember, you're never truly alone on the mountain, even when you think you are.